We are continuing in our series we've been in for the last several weeks. We'll be kind of concluding or taking a break from this series after Labor Day coming up. But we've been going through the book of Acts, which has been just so beneficial to me, covering topics that I wouldn't normally cover if I was just getting to pick, right? But whenever we walk through books of the Bible, we are just kind of forced even to just really cover the whole counsel of God. Right, 2 Timothy 3:16 tells us that all Scripture is breathed out by God and it's profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, instruction, and righteousness. And so that's what we want to do. We want to take the whole Bible. And so we're going to be digging into Acts chapter 5 this morning, kind of the second half of this story. But we're going to be talking a lot about attitude and really getting into that. And as I was thinking through that, and I was just looking at my life, an attitude. It's something we all have, right? Attitude is something we have, good and bad. But it's always been a struggle for me in my life. Anybody else struggle with attitude? You don't have to raise your hand. You're like, this morning. We had some people on the quick draw. It's like, I'm already raising it. No, but attitude is definitely over the years, and like I see it, and it's like, well, now it's my fault that my kid has a bad attitude in a lot of situations. And it's but I can't blame anybody but myself oftentimes. But one of the stories I was thinking about from my childhood was when my senior year of high school, I was on something called the High Q team. Anybody ever heard of a High Q team? Nobody, except for my wife. The High Q team is essentially like Nerd Olympics. And all of you were thinking, it's like, there's no way you were on that team. But no, I was on the High Q team. We would like go kind of like Jeopardy. We would compete against other schools, and we'd have different subjects. And so they put me over the subjects of math and sports. And so they would have like all these possible questions and things you're supposed to study and compete. And like I'm competitive about everything, right? If you got a paper clip and you're like, who can throw it in that trash can first? I'm going to be competitive about it. And so High Q was something else for me to be competitive about. And I remember going to this particular competition, and the school that I went to, me and my wife Kirsten, the high school we went to is like literally there's a cornfield across the street, right? Our city's population like 3,000. Think of like very country, not expected to do well at all. Right, because we're going in this competition against one of the schools that wins it every single year, this particular private school we won't mention. But we just, they had very low expectations, but my level of confidence was very high because I always can be pretty arrogant about things. And so I went in the situation, I'd studied, and I was ready. And man, we had this whole competition, and we're going back and forth, and we get to the final question, and we're down by like 1 point. Final question's worth like 10 points. So we're at this final question, and the final question is always a sports question. And what I knew was that most other schools didn't practice the sports questions as much because it was only one question. They only ever had one question of sports. And I knew that I was going to win this. I even looked at my team. I was like, man, we just needed to get this close at this point. It's like, I got him. Like, I was already thinking through, like, my speech. We're going to, like, you guys are carrying me away like Rudy after this thing because I got this in the back. And then the moderator comes and he asks the question. And the question was, remember like it was yesterday. What MLB pitcher has the record for most consecutive shutout innings in baseball? Anybody want to buzz in? Anybody got the answer? Nobody. Figured. But I knew it. And I even looked at the other team, and I was like, y'all don't have a chance. Like, looking at the other team, they've probably never seen a sports game in their entire lives. But I buzz in, and confidently, Whitney Ford. And the moderator says, correct, we have a winner. Like, crowd goes wild. My team's go, like, we're high-fiving. Like, it's one of the greatest moments of my life. Like, we're jumping around. We're going off stage because we weren't supposed to win. We weren't supposed to be there. Then all of a sudden, one of the judges comes over to the loudspeaker. And he says, please hold the applause. He said, we have a challenge. It's like, I don't even know what that is. It's like, we have a challenge. And what happened, the other team challenged my answer. And so they come, it was being recorded. They said, we got to play back the recording. And then we hear the answer, or we hear the question, we hear my answer, Whitney Ford, and we hear everybody going wild, and then they stop and they said, we have to make a correction. Mr. Ivy answered Whitney Ford. The correct answer is Whitey Ford. And so because of that, they get the question wrong, and they lose. Team that was supposed to win actually wins. So can you imagine in that moment, like the highest I'd been ever to now like the lowest I've ever been? Like I was even like trash talking. Can you imagine like how you trash talk now? Right? We just lost on my mispronunciation of a name. Think about how frustrating it is too. It's like, because I had the right answer, right? We can recognize I'm one letter off. My sister's name's Whitney. I just looked at it and assumed Whitney. What kind of name is Whitey, right? So I just assumed, right, it's actually Whitney. And man, my attitude, right, starting is the most prideful situation and how that affected everyone. But that bus ride home was like the most miserable bus ride of my entire experience. And everybody was like scared to speak because of how bad my attitude was. And now, looking back on that moment, it's like, man, who cares who won a high-Q challenge in rural Alabama? What I look back now on, what's far more important is how I made the people around me feel because of my terrible attitude. And attitude is not something you think like Scripture would talk about, but what we see in the passage we're going to be looking at today, man, your attitude makes such an insane difference on our life. And so we're going to be looking at, really digging into our last point. I'll give you a disclaimer. Is how do we just honor the Lord with our attitude? And so I want you to have that in context as we look at just kind of the story of kind of the early apostles and the early church and how their attitude greatly affected the church. And how much differently, literally, history would have been if they would have had the attitude like I had. And so that's what we're going to be looking at in Acts chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 12. But here's what I want to do. We're not going to read every verse because we're going all the way down through 42. But this week, at some point, I just challenge you to read all of Acts chapter 5, to really dig into it. I'm going to give you an overview of all what's going on here. But I really challenge you to dig into Acts chapter 5 this week. But starting in verse 12, I think before we get in, we need a little bit of a recap to kind of get you to this point. If you hadn't been with us, it wouldn't make sense to jump right in the middle of the story. A little bit of recap, starting in chapter 4, Peter and John, two of the lead apostles, they were going to the temple. And the reason they're going to the temple is to tell people about Jesus. And when they're on their way in, they saw a man at the door, and he had been lame since birth. He had never walked before in his life. And he was at the temple door asking for money. And Peter and John said, hey, we don't have any money, but what we do have, we give to you. Stand up and walk. Can you imagine that scene? This man literally gets up for the very first time in his life. Not only does it say that he begins to walk, he begins to leap. So they create a crowd in the temple. There's so many people that are like, how did you do this? What's going on? And Peter and John begin telling them about Jesus. And then you have the religious leaders of the day, the high priest. They're so upset about this that they take them in. They put them before this council called the Sanhedrin of 71 religious people, and they threaten their lives. And they say, hey, if you keep talking about this Jesus guy, it's not going to be good for your life. And they send them on their way. Right? And they could have went in hiding. They could have fled. But instead, they got all the believers together and they began to pray. They said, God, would you please give us the boldness to continue to preach Jesus? And then there's some issues even within the church, but there's just some radical generosity going on, and the church explodes. And then now we pick up in verse 12. Right? So that's everything that's come on to this point. Now in verse 12, it says, now many signs and wonders were regularly done among the people by the hands of the apostles. Continue to verse 15. It says, so that they even carried out the sick into the streets and laid them on cots and mats. that as Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on some of them. Right? God is moving in such an insane, miraculous way that there's just miraculous healings going on everywhere. And so you have people that don't even believe in Jesus. They said, man, if I can just bring my grandmother to go on Peter's path, and maybe his shadow will go by on my grandmother and she'll be healed. Like it's this insane moment in history of just miraculous, ongoing healings. And then we pick up in verse 17. It says, but the high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that is the party of the Sadducees, and filled with jealousy, they arrested the apostles and put them in public prison. Can you imagine how miserable of a person you have to be upset that people are healing other people? People that's been sick their entire lives, people that's had so much misery, that you're so upset and jealous of that situation that you arrest the guys bringing that healing? I just can't imagine how miserable of a person you have to be. How terrible of an attitude you have to be in a situation like that. All right, well, let's continue. Verse 19, right? They arrested him. Verse 19, it says, but during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the prison doors and brought them out and said, go and stand in the temple and speak to the people all the words of this life. When they heard this, they entered the temple at daybreak and began to teach. Now, it wasn't enough for God to show out and have miraculous healings. He said, hey, you guys are going to get arrested. They got arrested and during the night. Right, God shows up, Holy Spirit shows up and said, hey, you guys don't have to stay here. You guys just leave. But what I want you to do is when you guys leave, when the sun comes up in the morning, I want you to go tell people about Jesus. And that's exactly what happened. And then you have the religious leaders that arrested these guys. They come back on the scene. In verse 24, here's what it says about them. It says, they were greatly perplexed about them. Can you imagine the confusion there? Right? It's like, we just arrested you guys. We saw you guys like 12 hours ago. We put you guys in prison, and now you're out. And they didn't do what most people would do if they escaped prison, right? Most people like, hey, run for your life, go to another town, get a disguise, right? That's what most people do. No, they went back doing the exact thing that they got arrested for. And then it continues. What happened before we get to verse 33? It says that they confronted them right after 24. They're like, man, how did you guys get out? They even went and consulted the guards. They're like, we've been here the whole time. The doors are still locked. We don't know what happened. And they're a little nervous at this point. And they confront him. It's like, hey, y'all have to stop talking about this Jesus guy. And they said, we'll never stop talking about Jesus. And that's where it picks up in 33. And it says, and when they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. When they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. Little more backstory. These are the same people that sentenced Jesus to death. And now they're so furious to the point of death that their attitudes are so bad and so influenced each other that they wanted to kill these guys, that the only fault that they had was that they were healing people and telling people about Jesus. And they wanted them dead. But verse 34 starts with the word but. Right? If verse 34 doesn't happen, we were introduced to Gamaliel. We don't have this conjunction right here, they probably would have just killed him right then. But Gamaliel, he steps up and he says, hey, look, let me tell you a couple case studies about some guys over history. There's this one guy that he did the same thing. He kind of had a following. He even talked about being the Messiah and it even had a following, but it fizzled out because it wasn't legit. It wasn't true. Then there's another individual, the same thing happened. He gained this following, and people were wanting to just kind of crown him as Messiah and all this, and it didn't take long, it fizzled out. And here's what I know. if this isn't true, if what these guys are preaching, like Jesus isn't really the Messiah, then this is just going to fizzle out in no time. But if it is legit, if they really are apostles of God, then if you guys kill them, if you guys betray them, you would be opposing God. Daniel said, hey, y'all do what y'all want to do, but I'm not going to be in that position. Right? We just need to leave them alone and allow just whatever happens to happen. So we pick up in verse 41. Then they left the president of the council. Oh, but before this even, I'm sorry. Before they let him go, they said, hey, we're going to let you go, but we're going to beat you. It's not like a spanking like I received growing up. This is what they called a flogging. This is something they would beat them up to 39 times with a cat with this whip that had metal shards in it and bones and things that would literally rip the flesh from your body. So they do that, and they said, hey, we don't want to hear you talking about this Jesus guy again, and let him go. I can't imagine the state that I would have been in that situation. It's easy for me to get in a mindset of, hey, woe is me. Man, everyone's against me. Everything's going wrong. Nothing seems to go right. Can you imagine what they were thinking? They're like, man, we're just healing people. We're being so generous. We're selling everything we have, and we're giving it to other people. And how we get rewarded for that is imprisoned and then beaten to the maybe even the point of death. And then we're released, but we're threatened for our lives. And what we would even think about in that situation is like, man, you're completely okay with your terrible mindset about how terrible everything's going on, right? We would even kind of build onto that. It's like, man, that's terrible. Could you even see it from this angle? It's even worse than you thought, right? You didn't see that guy in the corner. He was actually making fun of you while this was going on. Right? That's how in today's time this scenario might go. But I believe what happens in verses 41 and 42 literally changed the course of history. Here's what it says in verse 44. Then they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. And every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that Christ is Jesus. Man, these two verses literally, I believe, changed the course of history, because we all would agree that it would have been completely okay for them to be like, you know what? I'm through with this. I'm going to go to the next town over where I'm not hated, where I'm not ridiculed, where I'm not literally have my life hanging in the balance. I'm going to mope around and be frustrated and upset. But it says they left rejoicing and continued to do the very thing they were instructed not to do. And here's why I think that happened. The first point that we have for this morning, and I think it's just foundational, that they really believed this. We may say this is true, but these guys really believed it, that nothing is outside the possibility of God. They truly believe that nothing is outside the possibility of God. And man, they were able to see evidence of this, right? At the beginning of the story. I mean, they're seeing healing literally by Peter's shadow. God was healing people. They looked in their situation, it's like, man, we were literally in prison at one point. And miraculously, we no longer were and got to continue doing the same thing we got put in prison for. They recognized that nothing was outside the possibility of God. And far too often, we have such a small view of who God is. We wouldn't say that, but often our life reflects that. Because we're often more concerned with how big our problems are instead of how big our God is. I mean, we get this example from the apostles in the story, just even the whole church. They said, man, we literally might lose our life. That's like a really good possibility. Some of them were probably hurting so bad, it's like, man, I would be okay losing my life at this point. But you know what? We get to continue to do this for our God, and there's nothing outside of his possibility. I imagine they even left that situation praying for the 71 of the Sanhedrin, the ones that just beat him. Imagine they left praying for the salvation of every one of them. Praying that God would miraculously turn their hearts away from their evil wickedness to Jesus. Because they really believed there was nothing outside of his possibility. And the reason I know that's true, that nothing's outside the possibility of God, is because God saved me. Even though I was a rebellious sinner, whenever I was an enemy of God, whenever I said, God, I don't need you, I can do it my own way. God knew that was even going to happen. And 2,000 years ago, he sent his only son, Jesus, to come to this earth, to live a perfect life and to take on the penalty for all my mistakes, all my failures. Take that penalty on himself and die on the cross for my sins, just so that we could be made right with God. We could be reconciled to the Father. And because of that, I know nothing is outside the possibility of our God. He not only did that for me, he did it for you as well. And you can trust and believe in that gospel today. And recognize that nothing is outside of his possibility. So the last challenge, before we move on, I really challenge you to not only start living like that, but to start praying like it. James 4:14 says, hey, you have not because you ask not. Let me say it one more time. You have not because you ask not. I really don't want to get to heaven one day and have the God of the universe, the one that spoke the stars into existence, say, hey, there's a lot I would have done in your family, in your community, in your workplace, if you would have asked. He said, but you have not because you ask not. And for some reason, many Christians today have relegated the only thing we ask from the Lord is to bless our food. I believe God in heaven is often insulted with our prayers and is saying, hey, there's so much more I want to do than just that. But I want you to ask. And I'm not saying God needs us to ask. God can do whatever he wants to do. But I think the ask is us really recognizing that our God is bigger than anything and everything. Because we wouldn't ask something we didn't think was possible. Maybe it's God in heaven just saying, hey, I just need you to trust me fully that I'm actually capable of doing that. So I want you to ask. So we will say that nothing is outside the possibility of God. But my challenge is that we start living like it. We start praying like it. The way the apostles did in this story. And the second thing that I'm going to, that's not encouraging, but it will help you on your outlook on life. It'll help you to examine things the way the apostles did. It'll help you have the attitude that they had, right? Because first, they saw how big their God was. Secondly, they realize this, that people will always oppose God. People will always oppose God. They always have and they always will. Like I had said in the beginning of the story, how crazy is it that you have people that are so miserable in their life, that they're upset, that you have guys healing people. Right, you're so mad about that. The people that have been entrusted to you, that you're caring for, right? These are the religious leaders, not just the outcasts. These are religious leaders, man. They're so upset that these other guys are getting a little bit of credit that they're giving straight to God. That they say, man, these guys have to be arrested. And the reason I think this point is foundational is that, man, if people are always going to oppose the God of the universe that literally gives you the breath to breathe, that provides every single thing for every single person, and they're also going to oppose you. If they're going to oppose the good living God of the world, why would we ever think we wouldn't face a lot of opposition here on earth? I think one of the things for desperate, just distraught attitudes is often unmet expectations. Right? That's one of the biggest sources of disappointment in life, of unmet expectations. Right? If we believe something's going to go a certain way, right? I believed I was going to win the high Q match. I knew I was going to win. That was my expectation. And then when that was unmet, my world crumbled. Maybe if you had the expectation that marriage was the one thing that was finally going to fulfill you, and then once you finally obtained that, you realize it wasn't the case, and your world crumbles, or getting the job you've always wanted was going to be the one thing that's going to fulfill you, and it's actually so much harder than you thought, and people oppose you in that situation, and your world crumbles. And what if we just continue to even start with having the opposition? Man, if people are going to oppose God, they're going to oppose me. And it's not going to be easy, because we're picking an even difficult route here on earth of representing Jesus and following him. And what if we begin to look at things even when the opposition comes? I can count it joy to encounter suffering for the sake of Jesus. And so these are two just big perspective shifts, right? Of seeing God for how big he is, and seeing just even the enemy, the opposition in the world for what it truly is. And then lastly, this is our main point we're going to spend the most time, is that your attitude is everything. Your attitude is everything. I spent a lot of time just thinking, like how can I really convey how important this is? How important it is to have a Christ-honoring attitude. And one of the things that was most convincing for me is just the worldly definition for attitude. If you just look it up on Google, the very first definition that shows up for attitude is a settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something. Typically one that is reflected in a person's behavior. And I love this definition. Because this is what it's saying is, what attitude is? It's something that beforehand, it's your settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something. So what that means is saying, it's saying no matter how bad your job situation is, no matter how much you don't get along with your kids, or maybe how frustrated you get there, or how bad your physical health is, or whatever it may be, it said, hey, before I even bring in the other thing, I'm going to have a settled way of thinking about it. I believe that's what happened with the apostles. They said, hey, we could die for following Jesus. We're going to be opposed, bad things are going to happen. But before we ever get into any of that, we're going to have a settled way of thinking about it. We're going to say, man, no matter what, we're going to praise the Lord. Right? We're going to do, in the words of Paul that comes in the story much later. It says, hey, to live is Christ, to die is gain. That means, hey, if we're killed for Jesus, man, we get the benefit. If they let us live, then we get to continue sharing about Jesus. If they imprison us, we're going to tell the guards about Jesus. And we get to have joy because we've settled no matter what comes. we have the joy. And when they have that settled way of thinking, then later it's reflected in a person's behavior. Because the apostles had it settled in their hearts and their minds, man, we're going to choose joy no matter what. It's the reason verse 42 was able to happen. That even they were beaten and betrayed and all these things happened, they continued going house to house telling people about Jesus. Because of their attitude. And look, none of us would have blamed them if they had the attitude of like, man, woe is me. Can you believe what's happened? Right, when we get in this situation, right, we are so frustrated about a situation, we just got to tell somebody, and what we really want from them is be like, man, that's so terrible. Right, we don't really want the person to be like, well, you know what? Look on the bright side. We usually don't want that. But that's the life-changing position to take. Here's what Zig Ziglar, this is not particularly a Christian, but he's just a leadership guru. He says, hey, your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your altitude. Your attitude, not your aptitude, will determine your aptitude. What this means is saying, hey, your attitude, not your ability, not your skill set, will determine how high and how far you go. And I believe this is seen over and over again in Scripture. Since the very first point was true, that there's nothing outside the possibility of God, right? God can do anything and everything. He's not saying, hey, I need somebody really skilled to pull off something. He said, hey, I need somebody with an attitude that says, hey, I want to do anything for Jesus no matter what. And the God of the universe wants to use that person to accomplish great things, right? I think about David. David, the very first time we're introduced to David, he's this young boy that says, man, I'll do anything for God. And God said, hey, I choose you to defeat Goliath. And David literally walks by thousands of soldiers and all their gear as they're shivering in fear with a slingshot and a couple of pebbles. And God used him to conquer Goliath. It's not because David had all these skills. He wasn't the best slingshot guy in all the world, because he said, hey, my attitude is, man, I'm going to live for Jesus no matter what. And if we begin to have that type of attitude, it radically begins to change our lives. And I love the quote by Henry Ford, even if you think you can or if you think you can't, you're right. Because it would have been really easy for, again, the apostles to have the attitude is like, man, we could be killed. We need to go into hiding. We need to leave. We need to even go on vacation. We need to take a break. And we even have been like, man, I'm with you. You're in a terrible situation. And I believe if that would have happened, we may not even have the church today, right? Because of their attitude, because of how God was working in that situation, it drastically changed the course of history. And so I want to ask the question, is like, how do we have a Christ-honoring attitude? I'm going to give you just like 4 helpful things. One that I see in the story and just throughout Scripture, if like, man, if we want to strive for this, strive for having a Christ-honoring attitude like these guys, like how do we get there? And the very first thing we see is to grow in gratitude. Grow in gratitude. The very first things the apostle done after getting beaten, they rejoiced and thanked God. I would be willing to bet a lot of money that wouldn't be the reaction of anybody in the room, right? Right? That's not at least the first reaction. One of the worst days of your entire life, saying, God, you know what? Thank you. But whenever they had the attitude, whenever they had settled it in their heart, that no matter what, they're going to choose joy. Whenever they realize, man, everything in our life is from God. Everything in my life is an opportunity to thank God. It drastically changed their behaviors because they could rejoice at suffering. is I want you to find a way to grow in gratitude. I talk about this a lot. Whatever way that may be, the way we do every single night with our son, we say, hey, what are some things that you're thankful for? And he goes through the list, and sometimes it's just repetitive, and sometimes you see him really thinking about it, even at 2, almost 3. But it's a challenge for us because he asks us the same question, and we got to come up with things in our life that we're thankful for, even when it's been a crappy day. Even when we don't feel thankful in the moment, we're going to choose, I'm going to choose gratitude even when it's difficult. Because there's much to be thankful for. There's much to be thankful for. The second, surround yourself with the right people. Surround yourself with the right people. If you want to grow in a Christ-honoring attitude, you must surround yourself with the right people because attitudes are contagious. Attitudes are contagious. I'm willing, again, to wager that not everyone in the group, not everyone in the church felt the way that it communicated, right? Not everyone started out rejoicing. But you had just at least enough people, enough Peters and Johns to say, hey, man, we're going to choose joy in this circumstance, that it was able to positively affect those around them. They say, you know what, that wasn't my first reaction. That's not what I immediately thought. But because you guys are making the right decision, man, it's contagious to me as well. Attitudes are contagious, and the same thing for a negative attitude. I look back on a time in my life, one of the most miserable seasons of my life was when I worked at a particular place where every person there had the worst attitude I've ever experienced. Every person talked about every person when they weren't in the room. Every person complained about everything possible. It's like, man, I caught an extra red light this morning. Can you believe that? It's going to be the worst day ever. Have you ever been around somebody like that? You're like, I am that person. All right, well, let's change. Let's get around the right people. And maybe you even need to be the catalyst in some of those situations because you're like, man, I can't get away from my family. Everybody's negative. Maybe you need to be the contagious attitude that changes for the positive, saying, you know what, I'm not going to allow us to sulk in this negativity. I want to hear about your problems, your issues, your concerns, but however long you talk about that, we're going to spend twice as long talking about something positive. We're going to talk twice as long about how God's working in some of those situations and see the benefits. We're going to talk twice as long about what we have to be grateful for. And we're going to choose, right, and have a settled way of thinking of saying, man, no, we're going to choose joy, even when it's difficult. Maybe you look at your spouse, or you look at a friend, a best friend, or somebody in your life saying, hey, man, if you see me choosing negative, choosing anger, choosing frustration, choosing shame, whatever it may be. No. Remind me that we're choosing now. We're settling it now that we're going to choose joy. Hang around the right people. Third, this was kind of a curveball to me. Like it just really came up in my study that if you want to grow in a Christ-honoring attitude, take care of your body. Take care of your body. 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20 says, or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. You know, an easy way to have a really negative attitude is to be really sleep deprived and tired. Right, like I know that, like I'm prone to migraines, and I know if I set my environments and I don't take care of myself in such a way that I'm more prone to those, right, it's negative on my relationship. It's negative on my attitude. Because attitude is a thing that it's like, hey, if I can't control the circumstances, I'm still going to choose this. But there's a lot of circumstances we can control. So maybe if you want to grow in your attitude, maybe you should start with just eating better, exercising, getting enough sleep. Maybe less binge watching of things. Whatever it may be for you. Maybe it's just a small step. It's like, hey, man, I'm going to just start walking for 10 minutes a day. Do something to even take care further of your body to say, man, I'm going to do this to even help me grow in my mental health and grow in my attitude. Because I want to honor Christ in my attitude. Lastly, change your focus. If you're always focusing on all the negative, you'll have a lot to focus on. Right? Just watch the news. If you only want to focus on the negative, you'll have a whole lot to focus on. But if you want to focus how God is working in and through the world, how he's working in and through your life, and be encouraged in life and not dwell on the negative, it'll radically change your attitude. Radically change not only what you've settled in your mind about situations, but that changes your behaviors. Now you react to certain situations. So you probably didn't expect to come to church this morning and get like a lesson that we would teach like most kindergartners, right? About, hey, we got to have a good attitude. But man, it's so foundational for every one of us in every stage of life. Because your attitude is radically going to change your behaviors, your outlook on your situation. Because there's a lot of circumstances and things in your life that you can't change. But what you can determine is how you're going to react to them. Are you going to choose to honor the Lord and choose joy in the situation? Or allow your frustration, your terrible circumstances to take over? I hope we choose joy. Would you pray with me? In this time, I say we all have a way to respond. Maybe in this time you can just respond to what we talked about in the beginning of the sermon of saying, hey, that gospel that Jesus died for me, I want to believe in that gospel for myself. And you can believe in Jesus today, and he can wipe away every mistake. He can make you right with him today. You can do that this morning. Maybe in this time of response, your response is saying, I need to choose joy. I need to grow in my gratitude in this area. Maybe pertaining to kids, or maybe pertaining to work, or maybe a family relationship, maybe finances, or whatever it may be. I want you to get it settled in your mind today of saying, God, this circumstance may not change in the coming future, but Lord, I'm going to settle my attitude about it. I'm going to settle the way that I'm looking at it and thinking about it. And Lord, I pray that you would help that to change my behavior when it comes to it. In this time, we just invite you to respond in whatever way you see fit.